Hello, I'm Dan Winter, as you know, Therify.net, fractalfield.com, and this is a very special recording entitled Plasma Healing, Crystal Healing, and Water Healing. And this is in honor of Victor Vallone, our wonderful therapist, healer from New Jersey, New England, who recently passed away. We'd like to really thank our benefactor from that area who really would like to honor the memory of Victor Vallone, especially of the many, many people that he was able to help. Victor was a pioneer in using Therify and plasma. He was amazing with animals, healed many, many dogs, and helped so many people. He was especially good and patient and diligent dealing with long-term issues. You know, we never make medical claims, but anecdotally, he suggested that longer sessions with Therify and sustained usage, and he was able to shrink the, quote, see tumors, and etc. And he did so many wonderful things that helped so many people, and we're honoring his memory today. So in that honor, this discussion is about the deep science of plasma healing and, you know, the inner physics, the molecular structure, the atomic structure. How and why does plasma healing and water healing and crystal healing work? The core principle suggesting very particularly that the core physics, the inner structure, molecularly and atomically, that enables water healing, plasma healing, and crystal healing is all the same. And specifically, it's based on the vortex of recursion, self-similarity in either atomic or molecular geometry, as suggested by the Star Mother kit in this slide, actually. So it's early July here in South France. It's warm, and we're preparing to do the amazing conference with Elena Denon and Jean-Charles Moyen in 2 weeks in Tours near Paris. And some of the slides you're about to see today are a preview of that, and you'll notice that a few of them have a little French on them, thanks to our very diligent Valerie, who is here working so hard at translating the challenging language of fractality into French. So anyway, this film is not in French, but some of the slides have some of that work on them. Anyway, so the first part of this film is about the background of what enables water healing. And for that, we need the slideshow entitled Plasma Intelligence, slide number 27. Here it is. Okay. So in the inner structure of the hydrogen molecule, we've shown it's fractal and implosive. And the inner structure of the noble gas, which is the central phase conjugate optical mechanism of Therify. And in the inner structure of certain crystal geometries, you have the possibility of turning inside out recursion, as illustrated by this slide. So when a structure enables recursive turning inside out or implosion in the very geometric of the waveform at the center of the atom or the molecular array, and we're about to see what that is, carbon C60 fullerene or clathrate in water, where it enables recursion in the atomic molecular structure, that generation of that centripetal implosive force is the key to the negentropy or self-organization, which is key to the healing, which is, of course, motorized by the key frequency signature that enables that implosion. So it's the recursive turning inside out that makes this fun. So we have many slides about that, and we thank many research partners who have done some beautiful graphics on turning inside out recursively in the torus is the mechanism of self-organization, even intelligence. Now, there's some pretty deep physics behind that, and even the fine structure constant. We're not going to go into the math, but notice that even the geometry of the equation to express golden mean ratio here is actually recursive. You know, it turns inside out. To express the value of golden ratio, you have an equation within an equation within an equation, perfect embedding self-similarity, and that becomes this archetypal slipknot. So, and obviously that's then the body itself is designed to enable that centripetal force by being designed by golden ratio. And notice that lightning is also based on fractality, perfect branching. And we know that people struck by lightning, Daniel Brinkley, etc., often have bliss experiences because that arc. And the key is that the arc, that spark, when it's recursive, creates that implosive force. Tesla spent much of his career on the magic of the carbon arc. You see, that's how he started. And we're going to see how the C60, the fullerene, is an example of generating that arc. And that when that spark gap is implosive, for example, we know when when an arc hits a thread of DNA or a thread monofilament of gold monofilament, that monofilament of gold or a DNA thread will measurably become a superconductor, because that implosion creates that perfect wave collapse path through center that is not only superconductive, but super information dense. So later when we see, for example, using the arc of the Therify power supply to zap water, which is one of the things that Victor Vallone pioneered dramatically. If you get the right arc across the water, that water gains centripetal force and is profoundly healing. And Victor Vallone spent the last part of his career really showing how that arc created incredibly healing water. It was really very inspiring. Okay, so we were at slide number about 35 here. Just one second. So yeah, so creating that arc to heal water recursively is the classic example is the flow form. So here you're feeding the centripetal force in the water, and the water is gaining spin density ultimately at the atomic level. And that's the idea of the flow form, the recursive turning inside out in the structure of water, dumping inertia in wave collapse from the outer molecular inertia towards center implosively, non-destructive collapse. So that spin density eventually ends up at the atomic heart at the Planck threshold in the center of hydrogen and water. And that's the recursion that's fun and powerful. So we're looking for structures where recursion is enabled, and that enables then implosive centripetal force, adding spin density at the very heart, as it were, of the pine cone at the Planck threshold. Okay, so that was the first series on the physics of water and water healing. The next section, and this is from the Tours lecture actually, is about how that spin density is implemented in plasma. So first, we're going to look, we have taught for many years about what the physics of ascension is, literally, and those films went viral. There's hundreds of thousands of views on our Physics of Ascension lecture, and you can see that at our 3 million view YouTube channel, youtube.com/Dan Winter Fractal Field. And so in short, we taught the physics of ascension was very specific when the superposed axes of charge rotation or spin, when the axes of spin are superposed, you have spin in the cube, but then you superpose an axis of spin on the cube, you have pentodeca, etc. Then you spin the spin on that in a longer wave, and you have a ratcheted dodeca DNA thread, and then you spin the spin on that, and you braid the DNA. So every time you're superposing an extra axis of spin rotation, the only definition of next dimension, and to do that more than 3 times, to go to the 4th, 5th, etc. dimension, the only way you can superpose another axis of spin and only create constructive wave interference is to use Golden ratio. So that recursive superposition of spin eventually implodes and propagates out the center of the pine cone right here at the Planck threshold, converting the transverse to the longitudinal wave, which is, the Kesjan body, the Bafran-Ka, the rainbow light body. And that's the physics of what enables lucid dreaming and traveling through death when you propagate coherently in the longitudinal array, the collective unconscious, etc. So that process of ascension, literally going to the next dimension, is measurable by power spectra in the DNA braid, in the EKG, and the EEG, as the more and more harmonics show up. And we know harmonic inclusiveness defines immune health medically. That's clear, solid physics. And that harmonic inclusiveness is only enabled by Golden ratio constructive interference. And so this is ascension when there's implosion of harmonics and spins, literally. So now that was slide number 28. We want slide number 29. So for example, here, in the physics literature, the studies of what frequencies trigger lucid dreaming, right here, notice that The harmonics that are most likely to trigger lucid dreaming by extensive physical study, well published, are in fact 25 and 40 hertz, which are relatively close to the equation, which we say more perfectly that would be 29 and 47 hertz. By the way, there's the gamma frequency. So it is known in physics what triggers lucid dreaming, the harmonics, and we now know why. You take that cascade and you perfect it, and that's called Therify, and Therify replicably triggers lucid dreaming. This is Maya's wonderful report, but there are many, many reports. So the ability to create a lucid dream is because the compression in your aura is perfected enough in the DNA and in the glands that the result of that compression is then the radiance of a very coherent kind of electromagnetic propagation called longitudinal or scalar. And that compression wave that is now coherent, propagating in a more orderly way, enables you to inhabit a larger array, and that is the lucid dream. So here's Marie Claire's lovely story of seeing the Grail cup in the Therify. And most of you know what the Therify is and how it works. But there's an example of plasma healing, and we want to understand the science behind the plasma healing. And so we're taking, as you see here, we take a complex infrasound harmonic here in the amplifier, and that's the cascade from about 20 hertz up to about 800 hertz. And that cascade of harmonics, all golden ratio times Planck, the infrasound, is modulated on a just sub-megahertz RF frequency. And so now I've got a single waveform, infrasound modulated on a sub-RF harmonic, in the megahertz range. And that now single waveform is dumped here to the far right in the bifilar Tesla coil. And in the bifilar, the term bifilar means it's split in two exactly 180 degrees out of phase waves. So when I had a mono signal coming in and I have literally a stereo signal coming out, and it emerges at 500,000 volts and is then fed to the noble gas in the plasma tubes here. And the noble gas now is emitting phase conjugate optics through noble gases, which are notorious to have this structure, the outer valence electron shell of that noble gas, enabling that same self-similarity in the plasma, how the plasma is healed, because it allows the vortex tornado to implode, non-destructive collapse, coherently in phase conjugate, all the way from the noble gas optics to the RF to the infrasound, a very big pine cone kissing noses, as it were. So the plasma can gain a whole lot of spin density at the core threshold here. Visualize Planck dimension here is at the center of the caduceus. So this is what the ancients called raising a Shem unto the Lord. It was making a time reversing field, which is how you age reverse. And that was the issue of the Anunnaki, who made those pictures of the plasma tubes in Egypt. And so here's the physics. So if you plot the frequencies, these are the frequencies here, starting the frequency cascade starts at 4.5 hertz, but the drive series here is just under 20 hertz. And so we have about 12 or so harmonics in this cascade. And notice this is very close to what Priori used. Priori got the information by imitating what Lakhovsky and Rife had done, and they were close, but not accurate to phase conjugation. And Priori did not know what phase conjugation was, as illustrated by the fact that he only used one tube. Obviously, you can't implode without a pair. But notice here, even in those studies, famously, and Chris Bird was one of the first ones who helped me look at this, that Priori achieved dramatic effects triggering plant growth, because when the longitudinal is emitted from that implosion, it's compressional. If those compressional waves arrive with symmetry, that will make the seed more centripetal, hint fertile, dramatically affecting seed germination rates and growth rates. And so here's some of the measurements we made. You've probably seen these on the Therify website of the live blood cell effect. So that actually the before on the left, the blood cells are clumped up, meaning less solubility, less access to chemical contact with their environment. And so blood that is all clumped up like this is literally not as strong or as bioactive as blood cells on the right, after Therify treatment where they're no longer clumped up in the rouleau, and that the cell that's able to stand by itself is literally stronger. And we've measured that many times, and those results are there. And this is just a clue to our new technology, which is we'll be launching very soon. It's called piezofire.com. Piezofire, P-H-I-R-E.com. And you can see the previews. So we take all that principle and we put it in a piezo oscillator with a super dielectric shungite. And also it's paired with optional use of a Tesla coil in the similar transducer. So these are very small, very inexpensive, and you can create that field between these two oscillators and do amazing things like pain reduction. And so you create basically a micro Therify field, and so this technology will be available very soon. But it's all based on the same principle, which is this implosion, which also is amazingly powerful in our smaller device, plasmafire.com, from Patrick. Okay, so now next example we want to use here is in terms of understanding the physics of plasma healing. We want to just look briefly again, and many of you have seen this, at the physics of Agnihotra, because Agnihotra is plasma. So how is plasma healing evident in the physics of Agnihotra? So you all know that, and I remember so well in Poland, they timed to the second, the moment of sunset, and just then they lit the plasma field flame of the ghee in the center of the copper cup, which literally is a phase conjugate pyramid. They have used copper or gold pyramids only in classic Indian Agnihotra. They call it the Homa. And at that moment, precisely at sunset, as I lit that ghee, I mean literally, my hair stood up. And that farm in Poland, where we learned more about this, the Homa Center, the whole area looks kind of like a desert. It ain't wonderful. However, that farm and the surrounding few acres was like the Garden of Eden. It was amazing. They say that at Bhopal and at Nagasaki, those who did Agnihotra survived. The reason they did is they made the plasma centripetal, Agnihotra. And so the cross point of the sunrise-sunset, which is literally four-wave mixing, enables a long-wave plasma of the sun to be superposed on the short-wave plasma of the burning ghee in this case. And this creates an electric field, 9-degree relationships. It's a phase conjugate electric field propagating and making the whole area more centripetal. Just like when a Tibetan saint dies, it's been proven you get more rainbows. The physics of that rainbow is the phase conjugate centripetal force, the reason color and rainbows exist. Study the physics, fractalfield.com/fractal photosynthesis. So indeed, the plasma of the Agnihotra, or the plasma of a saint who just died, adds centripetal force to the electric field of the environment, enabling rainbows, enabling the green flash. So this is an example of plasma healing because the spin density can go to the core and the tornado can implode, spin up, because the burning spin flame has centered finally at Planck, and that enables the propagation into the longitudinal array. So you touch the array by imploding the plasma. Touch the array, there's a keyword. So the next little series here on crystal healing, and again, this is from the French series because this is about crystal healing. And we're mentioning Marcel Vogel here. Let me just see if we can have this conversation appropriately. So our friend, that I worked with Marcel Vogel for many years. I stayed with him in Toronto for our Physics of Consciousness Symposium with Tiller and everyone. And then I sponsored or was there at the psychotronics lectures with Marcel Vogel out there in Colorado a couple times. And I also was a systems analyst. Well, he was a systems analyst. He was a scientist at IBM. I was a systems analyst at IBM. But more importantly, at that time, we were doing a project on the Tuoy Stone Atlantean fire crystal. And I was working with Louis Acker, who, after a fair amount of LSD, he so vividly remembered his past lives in Atlantis. And so we actually developed a series on the physics of the Atlantean fire crystal, what Casey called the Tuoy Stone, Tuoi. And the physics is actually quite instructive, that they use what's called a phase conjugate pump wave to cause the piezo crystal to implode. Now, there's a more advanced physics on that in the Koski-Frost crystal, which made 800 times its own weight in gravity, at fractalfield.com/propulsion, the wonderful book by our partner, Elizabeth Bill Donovan, called Glimpses of Epiphany, and you'll see the Koski-Frost crystal. But that was another piezo crystal, and it had this pump wave, and the phase conjugate pump wave looks like this. This is the harmonics from your glands when you have kundalini or bliss, and you see it's an implosive caduceus. We call it a phase conjugate pump wave, and that's how, for example, you implode crystals and make them phase conjugators. So the point we're making here is that I interviewed Marcel Vogel about this, and I realized that he had not learned how to align the facet planes, where you grind the facets, more accurately with the molecular planes. So you have to align the molecular planes with the facet planes very accurately to make a fire crystal. And Marcel only did that intuitively. And the other thing, Marcel then eventually intuited a way to have the strictly hex piezo. And when you're strictly hex, you're never implosive because there's no golden ratio in there anywhere. But he then made the crystal facets approximate that pyramid shape by making the facets make a cone shape in the crystal shape, and eventually tried to get close to implosion. But of course, Marcel didn't know what phase conjugation was, I don't think, although he knew Tom Bearden a bit, who certainly did. But the point here is that those crystals that Marcel Vogel developed, how they heal, this is the point now. I was there when Marcel was sitting in the lab in the Toronto Physics of Consciousness Symposium, and he had that crystal in his hand, and he had the plant. He was focused on a plant leaf, and the goal was to show the plant, which was hooked to a polygraph, Cleve Baxter, whom I also knew, and the technology was it's an electrode on the surface of the plant leaf, identical to the GSR electrode we had been using for many years in psychophysiology biofeedback, which is simply a resistance measure, and it's called a Wheatstone bridge. And so the resistance of the plant leaf goes down when it's happy and up when it ain't happy. It's pretty simple, actually. And so the plant leaf would tell you if it liked you. And they're doing this extensively at Damen-Hur now, and that's a nice thing. They're showing the music of trees. Point being, so there's Marcel Vogel, and we just had a huge meal at a Chinese restaurant, and I think he overdid it a little bit. But so he was sitting there focused, zapping, really focused on that plant leaf to prove that he could cause the plant leaf to say, "Hello, I feel you." And he sweated, and he did. He regularly was able to do that. But I'm suggesting he didn't understand the physics was that obviously that crystal, being hex and piezo, will never implode and never make anything longitudinal unless there's a phase conjugate pump wave, which in this case is the body of the person holding it. That if in your body you feel some bliss, implosion, you then make a phase conjugate pump wave, the harmonics of the frequencies of the glands and the chakras and the kundalini and the heart and the brain, they all make a golden ratio phase conjugate pump wave cascade, which never happens by itself in the quartz crystal. No way. So if you get some bliss in your body, then the crystal can focus that for you and dump out that longitudinal, that compressional wave that's aligned enough for the plant to say, "Oh, I feel you." The point being here is to understand that the quartz crystal by itself could never be the healer. No, the quartz crystal, because it couldn't make anything longitudinal. But the quartz crystal, in the presence of someone holding it, that's having some bliss trance euphoria, making this implosive cascade biologically, then the crystal can amplify that for you, and then that longitudinal wave can affect the plant, and you could then focus that on another person who needed healing. So it's just very important to understand that the quartz crystal by itself, I mean, it's a useful tool, but its only function there is to amplify your own bliss, trance, implosion, imploding brain waves, imploding heart waves, imploding gland waves. When you get a phase conjugate pump wave, which is the archetype of that caduceus, then and only then does the crystal become a healer. Now, the other nice question that Elena Denon asked, which I thought was so fun, she was saying that, when the Earth Alliance finally got to Saturn and Jupiter, and particularly Saturn, I think, that in the clouds above, they had these ancient floating cities, and they were still there. So you got this huge stone rock platform that's floating in the clouds, making its own gravity. You look under, there's nothing holding up. So I got a huge rock, half a mountain, floating in the clouds, holding up a city. Ancient technology. How did that work? Oh, question mark. How do you make a stone that floats? This is reminiscent of what's called unobtainium in the movie Avatar. That stone that floated? And that was the reason they were there destroying the indigenous rainforest, because they wanted the unobtainium, which is a metaphor for monoatomic gold, which is also implosive. So to understand how a piece of crystal could be healed enough to make its own gravity, therefore its own longitudinal, because the longitudinal wave is gravity. We point to the famous studies with Viktor Grebennikov, and we published all these pictures in the story at goldenmean.info/gravitypolitics. Briefly, so you know how Grebennikov is walking over a hill, and which is basically full of ancient insect skeletons, flying insects like a beehive. Now, you know that almost every ancient people on the planet knows that if grandma is sick, you tell her to go sleep on top of the beehive. Now, the reason you do that is the instructive physics. The crystal structure, the healing crystal structure of that beehive is the subject of this conversation. So if you research in the medical literature the cavity structure effect, which is the geometry of these little holes or cavities in the beehive's molecular geometry of the crystal structure of the bee skeleton, or the ancient insect skeletons who were flying, but their skeletons themselves were a gravity-making device, especially if the flapping of the wings of the bee were making a phase conjugate pump wave. I mean, a hum. You know why the pyramids are called the hummer. It's called the cavity structure effect. So research that in the medical literature, and they mentioned Grebennikov studying why bee skeletons cause healing. Because the implosive cavity structure effect in that bone, that ancient quasi-bone cartilage, had generated implosive capacitance. The cavity structure effect. Visualize literally that if you line the capacitance inside the skeleton, you make these little cones, and the cavity structure effect. And so now that is an ancient crystal structure, the skeleton of beehives, which is making healing and making gravity. So there's hundreds of films, I've seen some of them, so Grebennikov took a bunch of those ancient bee skeletons because he's walking over a hill one day full of bee skeletons, and he feels like he's floating, like a quiver, like something amazing's happening inside his body. So he decides to study the implications of these ancient bee skeletons. He puts a bunch of it inside a box. Here's a picture of the box. And now here's Grebennikov flying around. I mean, literally floating. He's got a gravity maker inside that box, and he's floating all over the neighborhood. I mean, this sounds incredible, but in fact, there's hundreds of reports and pictures and details, and I have further seen films, thanks to Richard in Switzerland, of actually they put these things in what looked like a motorcycle, and it's flying all over the place. This is a gravity-making, anti-gravity crystal structure, literally a stone that floats. So this is instructive to understand. Now, if you did that in a rock structure, basically you're making a super dielectric cavity structure effect, implosive capacitance. Clearly you can make a big stone on which to float a city if you understood why objects fall to the ground. Somebody should tell Einstein, NASA, and Stephen Hawking. So anyway, and so now we're getting a little bit more toward the physics of healing water. So particularly if the water is piezo, then if you dump the accurate vortex down the throat of that vortex, you take the piezo nature of the water, the capacitance of that water, and you implode it, which is push it through a vortex center point where the angle of approach, which the 60-degree light cone, which is the angle this makes, the transverse EMF will be poured in the throat of the vortex accurately enough to then be compressed and redirected into a longitudinal wave, and that's how you heal the water. So actually you get the hydrogen atom in the water, which we will look is implosive and fractal, able to absorb that spin constructively. You get centripetal spin density focused all the way down into the hydrogen spin of the water, and that increase in spin density defines solubility, bioavailability, hydration effect. Why do they call it hydrate based on hydrogen? Because hydrogen is so fractal that it can absorb implosive spin. So this is the physics of theimploder.com, and I started working on the design for that vortex almost 40 years ago. But the core physics of healing water then, and that's why if you take that spark, literally the spark output of Therify.net, and the spark itself, you set it up correctly and zap the water, the effect on the water is off the charts. Paul did a lot of work on that, and there's lots of ways to do that. The right arc across that water, and even Therify just in the water, just in the plasma tubes of Therify, absorbs a lot of that spin. So the final little section of this conversation then is the series on cold plasma. Now let's see if we can do this. Okay, so now we want to look at what there is in common about the geometry of the molecular atomic structure at the heart of plasma, noble gases, at the heart of the carbon arc of fullerene or the crystal of piezo, what enables that recursive implosion in the structure, and finally in the geometry at the heart of water, the fractal nature of hydrogen. So we're going to look at fullerene and clathrates, all based on this geometry you see right here. This is all discussed in this article, fractalfield.com/cold plasma. We want to see what there is in common about the clathrate, the fullerene, the hydrogen atom, in all three cases, healing plasma, healing crystal, and healing water, that enables that implosion and concentration of spin density. This is the early Therify plasma, which is what we were talking about when we wrote this article. And this is the article published in Grozine magazine about the results of our super imploder, theimploder.com, dramatic effect on hemp, growth effects, etc. So we're taking, as Schauberger did, the piezo water. That water needs to be piezo. So there was a little, quartz piezo powder in the water that Schauberger used. It had to be mineral rich because it had to be piezo and therefore conductive, implosive capacitance enabled, and then the water at the center would electrically implode, and that's how Victor Schauberger made electric power from a vortex, and that's also how you make gravity from a vortex. So the spin density here at the bottom tip is much greater, and there's a way out through center based on Planck, enabling implosive charge collapse, the definition of how to make water healing, how to create a voltage difference between the wide point and the narrow point, which is how a vortex can become a power generator, and the longitudinal wave that you push directionally out the bottom, if that vortex is piezoelectric, has a right angle related to 76 degrees, and that longitudinal wave you push out the bottom is how you make gravity with a vortex, how the Vimana, Nazi Bell, Hondabu worked. So the major point we wanted to make with adding this to the presentation was here. If you take that vortex geometry and you look at carbon nanostructures, for example, here is what's called a fullerene, okay? Obviously, it's the Star Mother kit, okay? So that's the carbon arc motor that enabled Tesla to launch his career. When he started experimenting with the carbon arc, that's led to everything else for Tesla. So, and that arc enabled that implosion, basically. So this is, now when we see the equation for hydrogen and all, you've seen our work on, I wrote Planck times golden ratio, predicted the 3 ionic hydrogen radii so accurately, that's the smoking gun, that hydrogen is built on fractality, and that's how hydrogen makes gravity and makes implosion at the heart of water. So this is another example of healing plasma. They called it the mana machine, actually, and this is reminiscent of, this is from Keshe, spinning the ping pong balls, and his car is floating. What's on the inside of the ping pong balls? Oh, the nanomaterial, which if it properly grew, it grew in this geometry, and And that's how you make the plasma implode, enabling gravity making and centripetal forces and healing power. So, of course, Keshe doesn't know how to make it pure enough and doesn't know how to measure the electric field, but it's a good example of healing plasma. So this is just a little background. So in summary, what we're saying is the force that enables plasma to be healed, noble gas inside Therify, the force that enables a crystal to be a healer, the phase conjugate pump wave, hits the piezo hex quartz, and then it becomes implosive. Your love literally enables that centripetal force to implode through Planck and spin up that lightning at the core heart that embeds you in the longitudinal array, which is the collective unconscious and God. For the Aboriginals, that was God, was that collective unconscious. The ancestor memory is God to the Aboriginal, and they're about right, because that is the longitudinal array that you need to touch to embed, and that's the physics of oneness, actually, which is the subject of my next talk at Rogers event in UK, how longitudinal array is the physics of oneness. So, this was just a little introduction and suggestion that it's so useful to look at the deep science between plasma healing, crystal healing, and water healing. It's all based on whether the tornado can get the lightning at the core in phase. And so the incredible spin density of the lightning at the core, like the hero in the movie Powder, who survived lightning. Ooh, reminds me of Kundalini. So I hope you enjoyed this. This, again, is in honor of Victor Vallone, a memorial to his amazing work with healing. And I'd like to thank again our benefactor, New Jersey area, wishing to honor the many people that Victor Vallone was able to help and heal and with our Therify.net. And so we'll be back soon. I hope you enjoyed. Blessings. Dan Winter here, over and out.